All right, welcome to our lecture on where contemporary services are located. These slides are designed to accompany the book The Cultural Landscape, and really this lecture is going to fit into about 3 different units potentially. So talked about industry and services as part of economic geography. What we're going to do is take that knowledge and apply it a little bit to rural landscapes, which fits in with that agriculture and rural geography unit. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about city and urban landscapes. And so again, we've kind of got 3 different units blending in here. I'm Miss Gall, of course. I'll be your host for the lecture. So when we talk about contemporary services, again, these are more modern. Okay, we're going to start talking about rural settlements, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about urban settlements. Okay, and about a little bit less than half the population these days lives in rural settlements, and largely that's to be found in the developed world, or developing world, sorry. In the developed world, we're already more than 50% of people live in cities as opposed to rural areas, and that change is rapidly happening in the developing world as well. So we talk about rural settlements. There's really 2 major kinds. We talk about clustered rural settlements, and we'll look at some maps and some examples of circular and linear settlements, and maybe talk a little bit about colonial America. And then we can talk about dispersed rural settlements. Okay, and clustered, as the name implies, means that the people are living closer together, and dispersed means that they're going to live further apart. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. And then maybe talk about some examples from the United States and a little bit about Great Britain and that enclosure movement. So we've got some diagrams here just to kind of help you visualize what we're talking about. So if we talk about circular clustered settlements, right? As the name implies, what we've got is roughly a circle based around some kind of like a town square. In this case, the town square happens to be anchored by a church on one end and a pond on the other. Okay, and all the houses are together around that, and then you'll notice that the farming activity occurs outside of that. And so these are the type of settlements you might see, for example, in New England was a great example of where you would see these kind of settlements in colonial America. Okay, the middle diagram, what we've got is it's more like that long lot system we've talked about a few times before. And as you would expect, because it's a linear pattern, the farmhouses are all going roughly in a line, and in this case the line happens to be along the river there. And then you've got the meadows, and then ultimately the farming lands a little bit further out. Okay, and this is the kind of settlement pattern you would expect to find anywhere there's a major river system. So for example, along, say, the Mississippi. Would be a great spot to find something like this. Okay, and again, those 2, the circular one and then the linear one, these are clustered rural developments. And then for dispersed, what we've got is one that's more like this, where the houses on the right, sorry, where the houses are really very far apart. Matter of fact, in the diagram, you can't really see them. All you can see are basically your lot lines. Okay, and we tend to see dispersed rural settlements more in places like Britain or North America, and trace that back in North America to that British heritage. And then in Britain, the settlements become increasingly dispersed with the advent of the enclosure movement, which in essence took what were common areas that were used by a great many people and fenced them in, and so that the nobles could use them more or less as their private estates, and forced those commoners off the land, and they had to either rent the land or pay for access to it in a way they hadn't before. And so this then encourages people to kind of move apart so that they can enclose their own land as well, in a model that historians are very familiar with, where lower class folks oftentimes tend to try and imitate upper class folks as a way of showing how well they've advanced in society and things like that. So we're going to shift gears now. We're going to talk about urban settlements. So now we're talking more about cities. And to start out, we'll talk a little bit about some of those differences, and then we'll get into and we'll talk about the percentage of people in cities a little bit, and the number of people in cities, and we'll look at and analyze some maps. So biggest thing you got to know about urban and rural settlements are some of the obvious things. Okay, urban settlements tend to be larger, and they have a higher density, which means not only do they have more people, but it's more people in a smaller space. Okay. And that's important because it's that more people in a smaller space and that clustering that forces people or allows people, depending on your viewpoint, to specialize. And that's where you start to see the development of specialized services. And because there are more people and because they're closer together, you get that threshold and range factors from our discussions of economic geography come into play, and now those are much smaller. So, in other words, the area for the threshold for a service is much smaller because there's so many more people living there, right? And the range people are willing to go to travel becomes much smaller as well, because why would I travel 6 miles to the grocery store if I can travel 6 blocks? Okay. And the other thing about cities that ends up really encouraging this as well is this idea of social heterogeneity. Okay, so social, we're just talking about society in this case. Hetero means difference. Okay, so we're talking about different groups in society. So because we've got all these different types of people, different cultures, different social classes, different backgrounds all coming together in cities, it encourages creativity, people play off of each other, and this is why so many major cities tend to have really a lot of creative enterprises, right? So we think about, LA, and one of the biggest things we think about, for example, is Hollywood. Think about New York, you tend to think about things like writing or Broadway or things like that. Okay, but and what we've seen across time is that more and more people come into cities for any number of reasons. Okay, so that increases the percentage of people in a society who live in cities, but it also increases just the sheer raw number. And a lot of those reasons tend to be, we touched on kind of that variety of experience and variety of services, but people also move into cities for better access to jobs. A lot of people enjoy living in the city because it provides a certain level of anonymity. Okay, so in rural communities, and if you've ever lived in a small town, you know this to be true, everybody knows everybody else's business, right? You can't do anything without your parents finding out about it. In cities, that doesn't tend to happen as much. It's much more anonymous. Okay, and that's why more people tend to live in cities than live in rural areas, or any number of those reasons. Okay, so if we look at, again, some maps here, and this is a world map, and this one was published in 2011, which means the data is probably a couple of years older than that. So it is a little bit old, but not so much so that the data is completely out of date. And if you look, what you see is definitely our more developed areas of the world tend to have higher percentages of folks living in urban areas. There are some areas that might surprise you, though. For example, how many folks in South America, what percentage of people in South America tend to live in urban areas, right? Or in, let's see, that is, I think it's Libya, right next to Egypt there, right? Where people live more in urban areas. And these things, when you stop and think about it, to some degree make sense, right? North America, very, very highly developed. Australia, very highly developed, right? Central and South America, not as highly developed, but they're developing, right? Kind of like with China, it's developing. So more and more people are moving into cities, and we're seeing this. Europe tends to be, even though it's not developing, right? Because populations are starting to go down and things like that. What you see is more and as higher levels of urbanization, right? Saudi Arabia, you would think, is an outlier, and then stop and think about how much of Saudi Arabia is desert, and you start to realize that large parts of the country are essentially uninhabitable. Okay, so last map we're going to look at, and really this is the last slide for the lecture, we're just going to look at spread of cities with differing population levels. So our big green dots mean that they have more than 10 million people. Our red dots mean they have somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. And then the little black dots are 3 to 5 million. Okay, so by and large, these are the ones you might expect. New York has more than 10 million people. LA has more than 10 million people. Tokyo, right, which is arguably the densest city in the world, has more than 10 million people. Manila maybe is a surprise. Shanghai, if you don't know much about China, or Beijing might be a surprise. Kolkata, Dhaka, right? These might be surprises to you if you don't know as much about those areas of the world. Delhi or Karachi, Istanbul, right? Cairo. So you might be surprised at the size of those cities. It might shock you to know that there are cities actually that are much smaller population-wise, right? London and Paris we tend to think of as being huge, huge cities, but they actually have much smaller populations than you might expect based on how well known they are. Okay, so just some things to think about, and with London and Paris also their importance in the world. So just some things to think about as you're going forward. Stop thinking about the types of rural settlements are really what we've talked about, and how services are spread out and how you get fewer services in rural settlements, and also then where do we find our major urban populations and where might we expect those, and what were some of the surprises we came across as we looked at density levels for percent of people living in urban areas, but then also where are the major cities at, right? Because again, some of them don't surprise you, but many of them might if you don't necessarily know as much about populations of the world. So feel free to go ahead, bring in any questions you've got to class, and I'd be delighted to answer them, and I will see you the next time we meet.